Hello everyone and welcome back. I'm sorry that it's taken so long to get another quick look to you, but I've been really wanting to do this one for a while, going off of the previous one that we did with Tovalor, and now going to Florian, Voldaren, Scion, so going with the werewolves and vampire themes for the sets that had just come out based around werewolves and vampires. So I know that Florian and Tovalor came out in the same set, and this Florian is not a legendary creature from the newest set of Crimson Vow, but I just thought it fit super nicely because Tovalor is a werewolf, Florian's a vampire, but don't worry, we'll look at some more legendary creatures from Crimson Vow soon, and hopefully not so long in between. But hopefully you have been keeping up with my stream at Twitch TV/Azoreign. You can find me there. I stream Monday nights, and I'm looking to expand either Saturday nights or Saturday mornings just for some standard content, climbing the rank ladder, doing some drafts. And if you haven't checked out my latest video, we managed to get 7 wins with a Simic draft that we put together, and we got the ultimate prize. We had 2 losses. We didn't hit the 3rd, and we got 7 wins in a row. We cracked some packs, turned in some gems, and it was a really good time. So hopefully you've been checking in with that. But without further ado, let's get into this Commander Quick Look for Florian, Voldaren, Scion. So the first thing that jumps out at me right away with Florian, well, before we start, let's go over what he is, his power, toughness, and his mana cost. So Florian is a 3 mana, 1 black and a red, so 1 colorless and a Rakdos for a legendary creature vampire noble at 3/3, and he has First Strike. Now, his ability that we're going to be basing our deck around says, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponents lost this turn. Exile one of those cards and put the rest at the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. So there's a lot of things to unpack with Florian here. So he's 3 mana for a 3/3, which is a really good return of your mana investment being 3 mana for a 3/3. He comes with First Strike, which is really nice. So the First Strike is really nothing to balk at. So he's a 3/3 with First Strike. He can take out a lot of things, especially if we can buff him up with some equipment that we're going to be using in Commander. We could really get him up to a 7/3, 7/5, 10/10, whatever, and he's got First Strike, and he's going to be able to block like a champion and attack in if we really want him to. But moving on from that, we look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the total amount of life our opponents lost this turn. So this is one of those cards that is put in a standard set that is, you just can look at it and you know that it is specifically made for Commander, where it says opponents with an S, not just your opponent across from you in a standard format. So if we have 3 opponents like we would in a game of Commander, let's say that our opponents lose 2 life. All 3 of our opponents just lost 2 life, but we get to look at the top 6 cards of our library. That is digging very deep. Now, we exile one of those cards. So we look at the top 6, we exile 1, and we get to play. And another thing that's really interesting about Florian is that he says you may play the exiled card. So if we really need a land, we can just play a land. It doesn't say you may cast. We can just play it. So Florian, just on the face, is super good. It's a really interesting card. And I just really liked Florian when I saw him when he was first spoiled and in the set of Midnight Hunt, because he's a vampire. So you would think, okay, we have a Rakdos legendary vampire. What is he going to do with vampires? But Florian actually doesn't say anything about vampires. He doesn't say if you control a vampire or whenever a vampire deals damage, look at the top X cards. Florian is just a Rakdos commander, and he is really cool. I love his style. I love the artwork on this card, the color pairing, the 3/3, the First Strike, all the stuff that we're going to get to do. Florian is just going to be a value Rakdos deck that's going to kill all of our opponents at the same time. So let's get further into the quick look and look at some other cards that we're going to be pairing with Florian to kill everyone at the same time while we dig through our deck. So first off, in this category that I'm terming, is to deal mass damage. So what we want to do with Florian, as he says, opponents, we're going to want to just deal damage to everyone around the board, and sometimes that includes ourselves. So the first card that we're going to be looking at is called Loyal Subordinate. It's 3 mana, 2 and a black. It has Menace. It's not really important, but it has Lieutenant. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, each opponent loses 3 life. Therefore, Florian, if he's still on the battlefield when we hit our post-combat main phase, we're going to get to look at the top 9 cards and exile one of them and play it. Next is Price of Progress. For 2 mana at instant speed, Price of Progress deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So this card is going to hit us, but hopefully if you're across the table from some lands matter decks, if they're 3, 4, even 5 colors, Price of Progress is just going to deal a hefty amount of damage to one player, and then any other player it deals damage to is just going to be icing on the cake. Say it deals 5 damage to one player, but another player has 5 basic lands, it's going to deal twice the number of non-basic lands, so you get 5 on one player, 10 on the other, and then maybe 1 or 2 from another player. You're looking at the top 17 to 18 cards of your library for 2 mana. Next is Chandra, Torch of Defiance. So for 4 mana, we get a Planeswalker. Her +1, exile the top card of your library. You may cast the card, and if you don't, Chandra deals 2 damage to each opponent. So again, you can just see what I'm trying to go with in these themes and how these cards are going to work together. And I don't really need to explain how Florian's ability works every time, so you get the picture. Chandra also allows us to add mana to our pool if we need to cast something. Her -3 deals 4 damage, so she's removal. Her -7 is an emblem. Whenever you cast a spell, this emblem deals 5 damage to target creature or player. So this card really is just modal. We're really using it for the +1. We're not trying to cast the spell. It's 4 mana, +1, cast a spell. It's pretty self-explanatory. Next is Flame Rift. So for 2 mana at sorcery speed, Flame Rift deals 4 damage to each player. So we're going to take a hit, but we're going to deal 4 damage to each of our opponents, and we're going to get to look at the top 12 cards. And that's saying that you're casting just one of these spells. If we cast Price of Progress and Flame Rift, and we have Loyal Subordinate out, we're going to be looking at like half of our library with Florian out. Next is Thermo Alchemist. So he's got Defender, and you tap the Alchemist. You deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, we untap the Alchemist. So we could tap him during our first main phase, cast an instant or sorcery, untap him, deal 2 more damage to each opponent, move to combat, deal combat damage, then post-combat, we just look at the top 40 cards of our deck. Next is Dragon's Approach. It's a common from Strixhaven, but Dragon's Approach deals 3 damage to each opponent. You may exile Dragon's Approach and 4 cards named Dragon's Approach from your graveyard, and if you do, search your library for a dragon creature card and put it onto the battlefield. A deck can have any number of cards named Dragon's Approach. I included this card if we wanted to fill some slots in and put 3, 4, 5 copies of Dragon's Approach. The exiling from our graveyard and finding a dragon is not exactly what we're aiming to do, but I just thought dealing 3 damage at sorcery speed to each opponent seems like a lot, especially with Florian. So I just wanted to include more of those effects, and especially since we can put multiple copies of Dragon's Approach in our deck. Next is probably a fan favorite among Rakdos players, is Rakdos Charm. So we choose 1, exile all cards from target player's graveyard at instant speed for 2 mana, or we can destroy an artifact. But the main thing that we're going to be trying to go with Florian is each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. So obviously, if we have a giant board, it's going to really hurt us. But mainly, this can get our opponent's life totals down, and then Florian is going to allow us to dig through our deck. Next is Sizzle. For 3 mana at sorcery speed, Sizzle deals 3 damage to each opponent. So again, the Dragon's Approach is basically Sizzle, but you can actually do something else with Dragon's Approach. If we have more in our deck, we can go find a dragon. So if you wanted to put your Goldspan dragon in your commander deck and exile Dragon's Approach, you can go get that later. Next is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. I'm sure a lot of you know exactly what this card is. It's a favorite in commander. So for 5 mana at a 2/4, when Grey Merchant enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is the devotion to black. We gain life, so we're going to gain life, drain our opponents, use Florian. Pretty self-explanatory. Next, we have some 2 cards that are pretty much the same. Firebrand Archer and the Kessig Flame Breather. So they're both 2 mana. The Archer is a 2/1. The Flame Breather is a 1/3. And whenever we cast a non-creature spell, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. They basically do the same thing. And if we pair that with anything else like a Thermo Alchemist, we deal 3 damage to each opponent, and then instant or sorcery, untap the Thermo Alchemist. You can just see how the damage is really going to just get rolling with these cards later on in the game. Next is Arterial Flow. It's a sorcery for 3 mana, 1 black, black. Each opponent discards 2 cards. If you control a vampire, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So our commander is obviously a vampire. We're not going to want to cast this without him on the battlefield. So it actually controls our opponent's hands really nicely, and it drains them for 2 and gains us 2. Next is Siphon Soul. Siphon Soul deals 2 damage to each other player, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. Really similar effects here. Next is Bantu's Monument, the monument set that came out with Amonkhet, which are really cool that I always loved. So Bantu's Monument is 3 mana. Black creatures cost 1 less to cast to help us reduce our commander. And whenever we cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. So we're just getting that effect where our commander costs less and we're draining the table. It seems really, really efficient. Next is Gutter Snipe, probably a favorite among Izzet players or just mono red players. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, we're going to deal 2 damage to each opponent. Next is a new card from the Commander Legends set, the Court of Ambition. So for 4 mana, 2 black, we cast an enchantment that makes us the Monarch. Monarch is always super fun to include in the game. I always like to do it when I can. And when Court of Ambition enters, we become the Monarch, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card, so you're either controlling hands or you're dealing 3 damage to them. But then, if we are the Monarch, instead, each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. So it basically, if you're not the Monarch, you could be dealing 3 or controlling hand sizes, but if you are the Monarch, you could be dealing 6 and continuing to control hand sizes by having them discard 2 cards. Court of Ambition just doesn't lose with Florian. Next is Heartless Hidetsugu. Again, this is probably pretty well known amongst Commander players. For 5 mana, 3 red, we can tap the Heartless Hidetsugu and deal damage to each player equal to half their life total rounded down. So, hypothetically, if this is on the battlefield and the game just starts, nobody loses life, everybody has 40 life, you tap this, it deals 20 damage to everybody, you're going to be looking at 20, 40, 60 cards with Florian out. Next is probably another fan favorite, is Torment of Hailfire. So for X black, we repeat the following process X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or draws a card. You're either going to be controlling the battlefield, controlling hand sizes, or making people lose a bunch of life, and you're going to get to look at the top whatever cards. Next is actually an interesting uncommon, Kardur Doomscourge. 2 in Rakdos. When Kardur Doomscourge enters the battlefield, until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able, and attack a player other than you if able. Whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. I really just like this effect, not that it's super powerful, but it basically goads the table. It forces combat, especially with Spellslinger decks or decks that really only have limited creatures who want to keep their 1 creature out. They cast their commander and leave it out. It's going to force that to attack. And someone other than you, so your opponents are basically going to take damage while you sit there and don't get attacked. Their creatures die, they lose life, you benefit off of Florian. Next is a common, Blood Tithe. So for 4 mana, each player loses 3 life and you gain life. Again, in that category that we had talked about before, just draining the table. The next card is Angrath, the Flame Chain. So for 5 mana, 3 in Rakdos. His +1, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. His -3, gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, it gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step if it had a converted mana 3 or less. -8, each opponent loses life equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. So basically, Angrath's +1 is going to drain the table, his -8 is going to drain the table, and his -3 gives us a bit of control in Rakdos colors. Next is another fan favorite amongst mono black players, Exsanguinate. X black. Each opponent loses X life and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. I don't even need to explain any more about this card. It's amazing. Put it in your deck. Next is Acidic Soil. So for 2 in a red, Acidic Soil does 1 damage to each player for each land they control. Again, it's going to hit us, but in the late game, it's really going to benefit us with Florian out to just dig through our deck. Next, we have Direfleet Ravager. So for 3 black, it's got Menace and Death Touch. When Direfleet Ravager enters the battlefield, each player loses 1/3 of their life total rounded up. So it's just going to, again, drain the table. Tectonic Giant. 2 red. Whenever Tectonic Giant attacks or becomes the target of a spell an opponent controls, choose 1. Tectonic Giant deals 3 damage to each opponent. Exile the top 2 cards of your library. Choose 1. Until end of your next turn, you may play that card. So it's either going to let us extend our hand size, quote unquote, or it's going to deal 3 damage to each opponent. Next is the Spawn of Mayhem. So for 2 black, it's got a spectacle cost of 1 black. So if an opponent lost life this turn, we can cast it for its spectacle cost. It's got Flying and Trample, and at the beginning of your upkeep, Spawn of Mayhem deals 1 damage to each player. Then, if you have 10 or less life, put a 1/1 counter on the Spawn. This is basically just to keep damage rolling if we don't have any other effects. If our instants and sorceries have already been cast, this is just going to keep dealing damage to our opponents. Next is Fiery Confluence. So for 2 red at sorcery speed, choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. Fiery Confluence deals 1 damage to each creature. Fiery Confluence deals 2 damage to each opponent. Or destroy target artifact. So we could destroy an artifact and deal 4 damage to each opponent. Or we can just straight up deal 6 damage to each opponent. Cut and Ribbons. We pay 2 mana for a sorcery. Cut deals 4 damage to target creature. And then Ribbons is X black black, and it basically turns into an Exsanguinate. Each opponent loses X life. We don't gain the life, but it allows us to drain the table. Pyrohemia, 2 red for an enchantment. At the beginning of the end step, if no creatures are on the battlefield, you must sacrifice Pyrohemia. But we pay 1 red mana, and it deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. So with Florian out, we're not going to want to pay to kill Florian, but we can pay 2 red mana and deal 2 damage to everyone to further drain the table, possibly kill off an opponent, and then we're going to get to benefit from Florian's ability. Next is the Wild Magic Sorcerer. So for 4 mana, 3 and a red, for an Orc Shaman, the first spell you cast from exile each turn is Cascade. So with Florian, we look at the top, we exile it, and then we cast it. So this is just more of the good stuff of the deck. So when we cast our spell from exile, let's say it's a 4 mana spell, we're going to Cascade. So we're going to exile the top card of our library until we exile a non-land card that costs less, and then we may cast it without paying its mana cost. So the Wild Magic Sorcerer just allows us to benefit from what we're already doing with Florian. Next is the classic mono red Torbrand, Thane of Redfell. So for 1 red, if a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. So our Pyrohemia for 1 now does 3. And then we do that a couple times, and we're probably just going to kill the table that way. Next is actually a favorite red card of mine, Neheb the Eternal. So for 5 mana, 3 red, we get a zombie Minotaur Warrior at Mythic, and inflict 3. So whenever this creature becomes blocked, it deals 3 damage. Defending player loses 3 life. It doesn't deal damage. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, so right when Florian triggers as well, we add red mana to our pool where each 1 life our opponent's lost equals 1 red mana. So this will just help us cast the card from exile that we just exiled with Florian. Next is Terror of the Peak. So for 3 red, flying, spells your opponents cast that target terror deal 3 damage. They need to pay 3 life to cast that spell and target Terror of the Peaks. Then whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So we can choose if we cast a creature in our first main phase, deal damage to an opponent, go to combat, do our combat shenanigans, get our post-combat main phase, and we're going to look at cards from our library. Next is the classic, what Rakdos is named after, is Rakdos, Lord of Riots. So for red, black, red, you can't cast Rakdos unless an opponent lost life this turn, which is basically all this deck is. It has flying and trample, and creatures you control cost 1 less for each 1 life your opponent's lost this turn. He's a 6/6 for 4 mana. We're already draining the table, and he makes our stuff cost less. Maybe we even throw in some Eldrazi in here to get some bonus off that. The next is Cryptborn Horror. So for 1 Rakdos hybrid, it's a 0/0 with trample, and when it enters the battlefield with X/1/1 counters, where X is the total amount of life lost from our opponents. So if we just deal 12 to each player or each opponent, it's going to come in as a 36/36 with trample. And the last card that we're going to look at is actually a land. It is the Shivan Gorge. So we add 1 colorless mana, or we can pay 2 and a red and tap the Shivan Gorge, deals 1 damage to each opponent. Again, just some ways to deal damage across the table and just drain the table. Well, there you have it. That's our quick look at Florian. Again, this isn't really a 99 card breakdown, but this is just what the card is on the front. So it's a 3 mana, 3/3 with first strike and an amazing ability that plays really well with what red and black already does, which is just deal damage to everyone, drain everyone, and then you get to look at the top X cards where X is the amount of life lost. So it doesn't say damage dealt, it doesn't say combat damage, it doesn't say anything like that. It just says if your opponent's lost life, and it combines that total. So Florian, I would not be surprised if some of you built this deck and you looked through your entire deck. You basically get to tutor with Florian. If you deal upwards of 60 to 80 damage, which, I mean, I don't know if you would be doing without just winning the game outright, but if you deal enough damage, you just tutor through your entire deck. And again, I'd be surprised if you weren't just winning at that point. But leave a comment below if you've built a Florian Voldaren Scion deck, and let me know how it's run for you. Be sure to check out my stream every Monday night and Saturday morning over at Twitch TV /Azoreign if you want to just check out some really cool standard gameplay, and feel free to join my Discord as well. The link is in my YouTube description, and it would really mean a lot to me if you just help support me in that other way. so then I can make sure to keep giving this content out. I love continuing to do Commander-related things, but I'm also just getting more into the Standard realm, as COVID is still a thing, and Standard is just another way to kind of keep up with the Magic gameplay. So I look forward to bringing you more Commander Quick Looks, but just be sure to check me out on all other platforms and just give your support. Thanks for watching.